On the night of July the 6th, a drone flew nearly 2,500 kilometers across Russian territory and hit a refinery in the city of Omsk, in the heart of Siberia, farther from the front line than London is from Moscow. That single strike, confirmed by Ukrainian sources and reported by United 24 media, closed a list that had been open for 4 years. Every one of Russia's 11 largest oil refineries had now been hit at least once. Omsk was the last one standing. It isn't standing untouched anymore, and that fact alone tells you something has shifted in this war, quietly, over the last 12 months, in a way that doesn't show up on a frontline map, but shows up in something Vladimir Putin cannot hide from his own population: the price of gasoline. For over 4 years, most of the world's attention on this war has followed the trench lines. Who took which village? Who lost how many kilometers? But there is a second war happening at the same time, far behind the front, and it targets something much harder to replace than territory. It targets money. Specifically, it targets the machine that turns Russian crude oil into the fuel, the diesel, and the export revenue that keeps Moscow's military spending afloat. And according to a growing body of evidence, satellite imagery, thermal data, and Russia's own government statements, that machine is breaking down. This is the story of how Ukraine, without a single major offensive breakthrough on the ground this year, has found a way to make Vladimir Putin publicly admit weakness for the first time in this war. Not on the battlefield. In a Kremlin meeting room, talking about gas stations. Let's go back to where this campaign actually started, because the fresh news from this summer only makes sense with that background in place. Ukraine's long-range drone strikes on Russian oil infrastructure were not new in 2026. They had been happening in smaller waves since the early years of the invasion. But according to a Wikipedia-documented timeline of what's now being called the 2025 to 2026 Russian fuel crisis, the campaign escalated sharply, starting in August of 2025. When strikes intensified in both frequency and precision. By September 2025, Reuters was reporting that Russia was already seeing shortages of certain fuel grades, with reduced refinery runs, cutting Russian oil refining by close to a fifth on some days, and disrupting exports out of key ports. Crimea and Russia's Far East were the first regions to feel it, with gasoline shortages showing up there as early as August 2025. At that point, this looked like a nuisance for Moscow, an inconvenience, not a crisis. That changed. By spring of 2026, the pattern had become relentless. Ukrainian forces struck the Ryazan refinery, one of the country's mid-sized but strategically important processing plants, and according to reporting compiled by United 24 media, that facility has had its processing suspended since May the 15th, following a drone strike, and it has not fully recovered since. The Kirishi refinery in the country's northwest, with an annual processing capacity between 20 and 21 million metric tons, was, in the same reporting, described as being repeatedly attacked throughout 2026. Kostovo, another major refinery, processing around 17 million tons a year, including more than 4. 8 million tons of gasoline annually was added to the list of confirmed hits. Then came the summer, and with it, an acceleration that even Russian officials struggled to spin. On the night of April the 29th, according to Euronews, a fresh overnight assault set the Sloviansk refinery in southern Russia ablaze, and Regional Governor Veniamin Kondratyev confirmed that falling debris killed one person in the town and wounded another nearby. That refinery processes close to 4 million tons of crude a year and is a key source of petroleum products exported through Russia's Black Sea ports, including fuel oil, naphtha, and marine fuel. It was in the same period, according to that same Euronews report, that Vladimir Putin sat down with his own officials at the Kremlin, chairing a meeting specifically about domestic fuel supplies, and said something Russian state messaging almost never allows, that the country was facing a certain deficit, not a triumph, not a controlled situation, a deficit. He told officials Russia was, in his words, going through a difficult period, though he added that Moscow would honor all its social obligations. He then turned to state television and promised that Russia's arms industries would quickly ramp up production of air defense systems, specifically to fend off the very Ukrainian attacks that had forced him to hold that meeting in the first place. That's not spin. That's an admission delivered on camera that Ukraine's strategy was working. The city of Yaroslavl, northeast of Moscow, became one of the most repeated targets in this entire campaign. According to the Kiev Post, drones struck the Slavneftyanis refinery there for the 7th time this year in early August, sparking another fire. That single facility is among Russia's top 5 largest refineries, capable of processing up to 15 million metric tons of crude annually, and it is jointly controlled by 2 of Russia's biggest state energy companies, Rosneft and Gazprom, who together own 7% of its shares. The Kiev Post's own count showed the plant had been hit in 2026 alone on July the 16th, July the 6th, May the 22nd, May the 8th, April the 26th, and March the 28th, before that 7th strike in August. Each time, previous strikes had already forced the plant to temporarily halt operations. This is not a one-off disruption. This is a facility that Ukrainian forces have chosen to return to again and again, because every time it goes offline, so does a meaningful slice of Russia's domestic fuel supply. And it wasn't isolated to one region. On August the 6th, CNBC reported that Ukraine's armed forces struck 2 refineries in a single night: the Bashneft-Novoil refinery in Bashkortostan, deep in Russia's interior, and the Slavnefteyanis refinery in Yaroslavl again. President Volodymyr Zelensky posted afterward that Ukraine's long-range strikes had, in his words, once again worked. Local residents in Yaroslavl were shown in photographs published alongside that reporting, queuing at a Gazprom Neft petrol station, because Russia had already introduced a swath of restrictions on petrol sales across the country in response to the shrinking domestic supply. Here's where the story needs a pause for honesty, because not every number in this war is clean or independently confirmed, and a responsible account has to say so. Ukraine's own strike claims the specific refineries hit, the specific dates, largely check out against satellite evidence and independent open source analysis. But the exact financial cost to Russia, the precise percentage drop in export revenue, and Moscow's own internal assessments of the damage are contested and, in some cases, only available through Ukrainian intelligence claims that cannot be independently verified the way a satellite photo can. Keep that distinction in mind as we go, because it matters. What can be verified, though, is genuinely striking. A joint analysis referenced by the Irish Times, drawing on data from the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, an energy policy research group, and from Frontelligence Insight, an analytical group run by a former Ukrainian officer, examined nighttime radiance data around 29 large Russian refineries between June 2022 and May 2026. That's satellite brightness data, a proxy for whether a refinery's flare stacks and processing units are actually running. The researchers found that after a first strike, radiance fell by 30% within 1 kilometer of a refinery, and by up to 18% within 5 kilometers. Isaac Levi, an energy policy analyst quoted in that same reporting, explained why this matters mechanically. Some of the units hit sit right at the start of the refining process, and if you damage those, a refinery can lose much of its ability to process crude, even if the rest of the plant is intact. A Russian brokerage, Finam, estimated in the same piece that repairs to this kind of damage usually take up to several months. And Sumit Ritolia, a senior modeling manager at the analytics company Kapler, told the Irish Times that damage to these specific unit types typically causes far longer outages than a strike on a storage tank, which might look spectacular on video, but is comparatively quick to repair. Put that together, and the picture is this. This isn't Ukraine lighting fires for headlines. This is a targeting campaign, refined over roughly 2 years, aimed specifically at the components of a refinery that are hardest to replace and take the longest to fix. According to that same Irish Times investigation, strike teams inside Ukraine's drone units are now being briefed by engineers on exactly which parts of Soviet-designed refinery systems are indispensable and hardest to source. That's not improvisation. That's an industrial-scale campaign built on institutional knowledge of how Russian refineries are actually built. The overall damage estimate from that analysis is worth repeating clearly, because it's the closest thing to a headline number in this whole story. The campaign has knocked out more than 30% of Russia's actual refining capacity and 45% of its nominal capacity, triggering what the Irish Times described as the worst fuel crisis inside Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union. An independent oil and gas analyst named Boris Ehrenstein, cited in Wikipedia's compiled timeline of the crisis, called it the most severe crisis in recent years, and said the scale, coordination, and repeated waves of the drone strikes have made it impossible for Russia to repair refineries before the next attack arrives. So, what does Moscow actually do when its own refining base is being ground down faster than it can rebuild it? The evidence shows a government cycling through emergency measures, one after another, in real time. First came the export bans. Russia introduced a temporary ban on gasoline exports back in the spring, and according to S&P Global, the government extended that full ban from April the 1st, then added a ban on diesel exports starting July the 9th. Both were originally set to expire at the end of July. They didn't. The Moscow Times reported that on July the 30th, Russia's government extended the gasoline and diesel export ban all the way through January the 31st of 2027, a full 6 months further than originally planned, because, in the government's own words, shortages continued to hit the domestic market. Jet fuel exports remained banned separately until the end of November. Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak, the official effectively running Russia's energy crisis response, told state media the country would also extend restrictions on diesel exports by non-producers until the end of the year, though he insisted the domestic balance was, in his words, gradually stabilizing, and that a number of refineries had returned to operation. That claim, that things are stabilizing, deserves scrutiny, because Russia's own actions on the ground tell a different story. RBC Ukraine, citing Ukrainian intelligence assessments, reported that official Russian public statements are increasingly at odds with reality, with the shortages, declining refinery output, and rapidly rising fuel prices, allegedly hidden behind claims of improvement. That's an assertion from a Ukrainian-sourced outlet about Russian state messaging, and it should be treated as an allegation, not a confirmed fact. But the pattern of emergency decrees coming out of Moscow at the same time officials insist things are under control is, at minimum, a genuine contradiction worth noting rather than smoothing over. And the decrees keep coming. The Moscow Times reported on August the 6th that the Russian government authorized the temporary sale of Euro 2 grade gasoline, a fuel standard that had been banned in Russia for more than a decade because of its high pollutant content. Russia had completed its transition to cleaner Euro 5 standard fuel back in 2016. Euro 2 gasoline permits up to 50 times more sulfur than Euro 5 fuel, and environmental experts quoted in that report warned that burning it increases smog and worsens conditions like asthma in Russian cities. Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin signed the decree himself, and the Energy Ministry described it openly as an anti-crisis measure. Think about what that means. A government does not deliberately unwind more than a decade of fuel quality regulation publicly, unless it genuinely believes it has no other short-term option to keep gas stations supplied. The human details from the same reporting period are almost surreal for a country that presents itself as a global energy superpower. The governor of Russia's Vologda region, Georgy Filimonov, said he personally ran out of gasoline while driving and had to hitch a ride with the traffic police to get where he was going. That's not a rural villager. That's a sitting regional governor publicly admitting he couldn't find fuel. In the same period, the online marketplaces Avito, Ozon, and Wildberries either hid or outright banned gasoline trading advertisements on their platforms. Novak, asked directly about the state of the market, described it to Russian media as, quote, challenging but under control, an assessment that sits awkwardly next to a governor stranded on the roadside and a nationwide rollback of fuel safety standards happening in the very same week. Crimea, the peninsula Russia annexed in 2014, has arguably felt this earlier and harder than almost anywhere else in the country. According to earlier Moscow Times reporting on the broader crisis, Sergei Aksionov, the Kremlin-backed head of Crimea, appeared in a video statement acknowledging that some oil refineries were, in his words, physically not functioning, and asked Crimean residents and visitors to remain patient, describing the situation as an unavoidable consequence of, quote, objective factors, a phrase that conspicuously avoided naming Ukrainian drone strikes as the cause, even as he promised standard AI-95 fuel would return to Crimean stations within 2 days and lower-octane AI-92 fuel within 2 weeks. Wholesale prices for that AI-92 fuel, according to the same reporting, hit a record high of 73,848 rubles per ton, roughly $888 US, around the same period. Wikipedia's compiled account of the broader crisis adds further texture. At points during 2026, Politico reported that 2/3 of Russia's regions were experiencing fuel supply issues affecting millions of ordinary Russians and threatening businesses, and Crimea, at one stage, declared a formal state of emergency over fuel, with authorities there temporarily banning fuel sales outright. It's worth understanding where this campaign actually came from, because it didn't begin as a strategy aimed at gas stations. According to reporting compiled by Bitcoin Ethereum News and republished by MXC, Kyiv began targeting Russian oil refineries in a serious way in late 2023, at a point when Ukraine lacked the long-range Western weapons it wanted for deep strikes inside Russia. And so it invested instead in building its own domestic fleet of long-range drones. That same reporting noted that the Biden administration, worried at the time about rising global oil prices, actually expressed frustration over some of those early strikes. By 2024, independent journalist Natalia Kabash, writing for NV Business, calculated that just 2 refineries alone, the Slavneft Yanos plant in Yaroslavl and the Volgograd refinery run by Lukoil, processed a combined 30 million tons of oil annually, and noted that Ukrainian drones costing several million hryvnias were causing damage worth hundreds of millions of dollars. That cost asymmetry is, in blunt terms, the entire logic of the campaign. A drone that costs a fraction of what it destroys is a weapon Ukraine can afford to use relentlessly, in a way it could never afford to replicate with manned aircraft or expensive Western cruise missiles. The campaign didn't stay confined to refineries sitting inland. It expanded outward to the infrastructure that actually gets Russian oil to buyers overseas. Reuters reporting carried by the Moscow Times in late March of 2026 found that Ukrainian drone attacks had, by that point, knocked out about 40% of Russia's oil export capacity, disrupting shipments from major Baltic and Black Sea ports, in what Reuters called the most severe oil supply disruption in modern Russian history. That reporting detailed strikes suspending loadings at Primorsk and Ust-Luga, Russia's 2 largest Baltic ports, after repeated drone attacks triggered fires and infrastructure damage, while the Black Sea port of Novorossiysk with a capacity of roughly 700,000 barrels a day, fell behind its own loading schedule. On top of that, Reuters noted that Russia's pipeline exports to Hungary and Slovakia had been effectively halted since January because of damage to the Druzhba pipeline running through Ukraine. Altogether, roughly 40% of Russia's oil export capacity, about 2 million barrels a day, was offline as of that report. By August, the Moscow Times was still tracking fresh strikes on Baltic ports, describing them as part of a deliberate Ukrainian effort to deprive Moscow of windfall profits during a period of rising global oil prices, with an industrial site damaged near the Kirchneftorg-Syntez refinery in Primorsk port, again forced to suspend operations. The financial numbers behind all of this are where the picture becomes genuinely hard for the Kremlin to spin away, and they come from sources with no obvious incentive to exaggerate Ukraine's success: international energy monitors and Russia's own finance ministry. The International Energy Agency, an intergovernmental body that tracks global energy markets, found that Russia's export revenues for oil and petroleum products fell in February of 2026 to just $5 billion, the lowest monthly level recorded since the start of the full-scale invasion in 2022, according to analysis published by Chatham House, the international affairs think tank. That same analysis noted Russian oil export volumes had dropped to 6 million barrels a day, down 850,000 barrels a day from the previous month, again the lowest level since 2022, and attributed the decline not only to sanctions, but explicitly to Ukrainian drone and missile strikes on Russia's energy infrastructure. Months earlier, the IEA had already found that Russia's oil export revenues had fallen to their lowest monthly level since the invasion began, according to reporting by CNN and Gulf News, which also revealed that Ukraine had expanded the campaign further still, striking a Lukoil-operated offshore platform in the Caspian Sea for the first time, a mission a Ukrainian security service source described bluntly. Any enterprise working for the Russian war effort, the source said, is a legitimate target. Ukraine's own sanctions commissioner, Vladislav Vlasyuk, has taken to calling the entire campaign, quote, long-range sanctions on Moscow's financial lifeline. Russia's own finance ministry data confirms the strain rather than contradicts it. Reuters, reporting from March of 2026, found that Russia's combined oil and gas budget revenue in February had dropped 18% year-on-year, and by January of that year, a 50%. 2% collapse in monthly oil and gas revenue had already been recorded, driven by lower oil prices layered on top of the physical disruption to refining and export capacity. Fossil fuel revenue has traditionally represented somewhere around 30% of Russia's entire federal budget, which is precisely why an extended, sustained drop in that revenue stream matters so much more than a single fire at a single facility ever could. Trading economics data shows Russia's federal budget deficit widening to 449 trillion rubles in the first 2 months of 2026 alone, up sharply from the same period the year before, with revenues down almost 11% year-on-year, even as wartime spending kept climbing. Reporting from Fortune, citing a letter reviewed by the Financial Times, found Russia's own finance ministry privately estimated in February that war spending was on pace to exceed budget by at least 2 trillion rubles this year, roughly $28 billion, with a more pessimistic internal scenario putting the overrun at 4 trillion rubles. And the ministry was reportedly asking Moscow's own cabinet to freeze trillions of rubles in non-defense spending just to keep the war funded. That same Fortune report noted Russian battlefield casualties have climbed to more than 30,000 a month, which drains the Kremlin's finances even further, since recruitment now requires increasingly large cash incentives and death benefits to keep replacement troops coming. None of that is happening in isolation from the outside world either. A European Commission announcement covered in one industry newsletter described the EU unveiling its 19th sanctions package against Russia, specifically targeting Russian oil exports further and moving up a full halt on European imports of Russian liquefied natural gas to January of 2027, a full year earlier than originally planned. That same roundup noted Russia's own government had, by that point, adopted the core parameters of its 2026 federal budget, built around a planned deficit of 6 trillion rubles, a number that assumes a level of oil and gas income the drone campaign is actively working to deny it. Now here's the piece that turns this from a domestic Russian headache into a story about the war itself, because that's ultimately what this campaign is designed to achieve. Every one of these refineries doesn't just produce gasoline for commuters in Moscow or Yaroslavl. It produces diesel for military vehicles, jet fuel for aircraft, and, critically, it generates the export revenue that funds a huge share of Russia's war spending. President Zelensky has been explicit and consistent about this being the entire point. According to United 24 Media, Zelensky has repeatedly stated that the objective of this refinery campaign is to force Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table, by shrinking the revenue Russia earns from petroleum product exports, which in turn shrinks the resources available to finance weapons production and sustain the Russian military. The logic is simple and, based on the evidence so far, appears to be functioning as designed. Every day, hundreds of Ukrainian drones now target Russian oil refineries, logistics hubs, military factories, and bases, according to that same reporting. And the campaign has expanded Ukraine's long-range strike reach to distances that, as United 24 put it, would have seemed unimaginable just a few years ago. The Omsk strike, at over 2,500 kilometers, is the clearest proof of that expanded reach. And it happened using FP-1 drones, a platform Ukraine has developed specifically to push deep strike distances further than earlier drone models could manage. This campaign has also become entangled with the diplomatic track of the war. And the timing here is worth laying out plainly, because it isn't a coincidence. Bloomberg reported that on July the 29th, Ukraine attacked 2 major Russian oil refineries overnight. Its first strikes on large oil processing facilities in nearly 2 weeks, hitting the Ryazan refinery among others. The Washington Post, covering the same strikes, connected them directly to the political calendar. Those attacks came hours after Zelensky met with members of the U.S. Senate in Washington to discuss what that reporting identified as the Lindsey O. Graham Sanctioning Russia and Iran Act of 2286, bipartisan legislation aimed at tightening sanctions pressure on Moscow. Zelensky was photographed arriving at the U.S. Capitol for that meeting, alongside Senators Richard Blumenthal, Katie Boyd Britt, Roger Wicker, and James Risch. The message being sent, intentionally or not, was unmistakable. Sanctions pressure in Washington and drone pressure inside Russia, arriving in the same news cycle, aimed at the exact same target, the money that keeps Putin's war funded. It's also worth being clear-eyed about what this campaign has not done, because an honest account doesn't inflate a real story into something bigger than it is. This is not the same as Russia running out of oil. Russia remains one of the largest oil-producing nations on Earth, and its crude extraction capacity has not been the primary target. Its refining capacity has. There's a meaningful difference between a country that can't pump oil and a country that struggles to turn that oil into usable fuel and sellable export product. Russia has also shown real adaptive capacity. According to S&P Global's reporting, a ship called the Garnet reached the Russian port of Vitino in the White Sea over June the 25th and 26th, marking the first confirmed shipment of Indian fuel into Russia, after India's oil minister, Hardeep Singh Puri, said earlier in July that India had the capacity to send refined oil products to Russia, though he did not elaborate on the terms of any agreement. That's Moscow importing finished fuel to plug the exact gap this campaign has created. Proof the pressure is real, but also proof Russia isn't simply collapsing under it. So where does that leave the overall picture, heading into the second week of August 2026? The pattern researched across dozens of sources over the last year is consistent, and it is verifiable in a way that few claims about this war actually are, because you can watch it happen through commercial satellite data, not just official statements from either side. Ukraine has systematically worked through the full list of Russia's largest refineries, all 11 of the biggest ones, according to United 24's tracking, and it has returned to some of them, like the Yaroslavl facility, 7 separate times in a single year. Independent analysts using thermal imaging have confirmed real, physical, lasting damage, not just cosmetic fires. Russia's own government has responded with a cascade of emergency decrees. Export bans extended into 2027, banned low-grade fuel resurrected after more than a decade, price caps suspended, foreign fuel imports arranged. That only makes sense if the underlying pressure is genuine. And Vladimir Putin himself, on camera, used the word deficit to describe his own country's fuel situation, a level of public candor about weakness that this war has rarely produced from the Kremlin. There's also a broader framing worth including, because it puts this refinery campaign into the context of the wider war, rather than treating it as an isolated economic story. Fortune's reporting, drawing on the same period, described what it called a new phase of combat, with Ukrainian drone attacks not only hammering Russian oil infrastructure, but increasingly disrupting the supply lines connecting Russia to occupied Ukrainian territory as well, effectively freezing some Russian troop movements in place, even as Ukraine has started making incremental gains of its own in certain sectors. That reporting used the phrase drone overmatch to describe the shift. The idea that Ukraine's ability to build, deploy, and successfully fly long-range drones deep into Russian territory has now outpaced Russia's ability to intercept them consistently, particularly against the newest platforms operating at ranges like the 2,500 kilometers reached at Omsk. American officials have taken notice publicly too. Coverage of a meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky referenced Trump describing Russia as a, quote, paper tiger. Remarks made in the same news cycle as the European Commission's 19th sanctions package targeting Russian oil exports and the planned early cutoff of European purchases of Russian liquefied natural gas. Whatever one makes of that specific phrase, the underlying signal from Washington and Brussels in this period has been consistent. A belief, reflected in policy, that Russia's energy-funded war economy is a viable pressure point, and that squeezing it in parallel with Ukraine's own drone campaign is a coordinated, not incidental, strategy. It's also worth naming directly why this particular form of pressure is so difficult for Moscow to simply absorb the way it has absorbed other forms of sanctions since 2022. Rerouting oil sales to buyers like China and India, something Russia has done successfully for several years now, only works if the oil can actually be refined and loaded onto ships or pipelines in the first place. Sanctions restrict who Russia can sell to and at what price. Drone strikes restrict whether Russia can physically produce and move the product at all. Those are two different kinds of pressure, and the evidence from this past year suggests Ukraine identified that the second kind, physical, sustained, and aimed at the hardest to replace refinery components, was the one still available to it after years of sanctions had already been layered on by Western governments. Isaac Levi's point about refineries losing much of their processing ability, even when other equipment survives, isn't just a technical detail. It's the reason a relatively small, cheap drone can take a facility, processing millions of tons of crude a year offline for months at a time, repeatedly, faster than Russia's own repair crews and air defense units can keep up. None of that guarantees where this goes next. Wars have a habit of producing turning points that later turn out not to have turned anything at all. Russia could stabilize its refining base faster than current trends suggest, particularly if it continues importing finished fuel from partners like India, or if it manages to harden refineries against further drone strikes, something Russian air defense units have been visibly trying to prioritize since Putin's own June pledge to ramp up that production. Equally, Ukraine's campaign depends on a sustained supply of long-range drones and continued success penetrating Russian air defenses at distances of well over 2,000 kilometers, which is not guaranteed to continue at the same pace indefinitely. But based on everything that can currently be verified, from named Ukrainian and Russian officials, from Reuters, the Associated Press, Bloomberg, CNBC, and the Washington Post, from independent energy analysts at organizations like the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air and KPLR, and from Russia's own extended export bans and emergency fuel quality decrees, the core claim in this story holds up. Ukraine identified the asset that actually keeps Vladimir Putin's war machine funded, not tanks, not troop numbers, but refined fuel and export revenue, and it built a long-range campaign specifically to break it. And for the first time since this war began, Putin's own government has had to publicly admit, in its own words and its own emergency decrees, that the strategy is working. Before wrapping up, it's worth being transparent about where the edges of this story are. The specific strike counts on individual refineries, Yaroslavl's 7 hits, Omsk's record distance strike, the Bashkortostan attack, come from Ukrainian military statements and Zelensky's own public posts, cross-referenced against independent satellite and thermal imaging analysis from groups like the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air and for Intelligence Insight, along with wire reporting from Reuters, Bloomberg, and the Associated Press. Those are about as well corroborated as battlefield claims get in this war. What remains genuinely contested is the exact scale of the financial damage to Russia's war budget, and how much of Moscow's public messaging about stabilization is accurate versus how much is, as Ukrainian intelligence sources allege, an attempt to downplay a deepening crisis. That specific allegation about Kremlin messaging comes from Ukrainian-sourced reporting and has not been independently verified the way the physical strike damage has. So it's presented here as a claim, not a confirmed fact. So here's the honest question worth sitting with. If a country can no longer guarantee stable gasoline supplies to its own governors, its own regional capitals, and its own annexed territories, while simultaneously insisting the war effort is fully funded and unaffected, which of those two realities do you think is actually true? And which one is the story a government tells itself when it doesn't want to admit how much pressure it's actually under? Let me know what you think, and if there's a piece of this you think deserves a closer, deeper look, drop it below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.